This marks the beginning of videotape number 1 in the deposition of James Sobek. We are on the record at 10:37 a.m.
Would you raise your right hand, please? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your name.
James Stephen Sobek. Stephen is S-T-E-P-H-E-N.
And Mr. Sobek, we are here today to take your deposition in the case styled Joyce Talent, a surviving parent of Kennard Rickey versus Jason Taylor, which is pending in Jasper County, Missouri. You have been retained as an expert witness by the plaintiff in this case, is that correct?
It is.
And you have given me lists of deposition and trial testimony in which you have testified. So I know that you have testified many times before. The deposition is nothing new for you, correct?
That is correct.
I will try to state my questions clearly, but if I do not state my question clearly, please let me know and I will restate it.
I will.
If you answer my question, I'm going to assume you understood it. Is that fair enough?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Let's start with your date of birth.
July 13th, 1942.
And your social security number?
It's 114.
Okay. And Mr. Sobek, you work for Wolf Technical Services, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And are you a principal in Wolf Technical Services?
No, I am not.
Okay. Is Wolf Technical Services primarily in the business of doing forensic analysis for litigation?
With reference to your word primarily, no. That actually is less than 50% of our business these days.
Okay. And what about your personal work? How much of your work is for forensic litigation?
I would say currently it's around 65 to 70% of my work time.
Okay. And what percentage of your income comes from litigation?
About 85%.
And you have given me copies of testimony that you've given from deposition testimony that you've given from 1988 through 2014 that we've marked as Exhibit C. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And I'm assuming that you worked on a number of cases that you did not give depositions in?
Oh, certainly.
Okay. But during that period of time, I noticed on the last page you have the totals of the number of cases you've given depositions on. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the number of depositions you've given for defendants is?
71.
And the number of depositions you've given for plaintiffs is?
179.
Okay.
Just to be clear, it's a minor detail, but there are, I think, oh, wait, no, that's true for trials, not depositions. I was going to say that I've done some work for the American Board of Trial Advocates where we appeared as depositions in a mock trial, but that's not true for depositions. We appeared in trials, mock trials.
Okay. And those are listed on your trial testimony sheet?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And we've marked your trial testimony sheet as Defendant's Exhibit D. And it goes from February 28th, 1989 to March 6, 2014. Is that the one that you were referring to includes mock trials?
Yes.
Okay. And with respect to the number of trial testimony that you have given for defendants is how much?
There were 36.
And for plaintiffs?
87.
Okay. And do we know on the mock trials how many of those would have been mock trials?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those, and they were all marked as being plaintiff in each case, so the 87 would drop down to 82 now.
Okay, so 82 for plaintiffs, and how many for defendants again?
36.
Thank you. Mr. Sobek, I'm going to show you what we've marked as Exhibit B. Is this your current CV?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay. In reviewing that, it looks like you have a Bachelor of Arts degree in physics with a minor in math and chemistry. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have like a master's degree or doctoral degree or anything
I
of that
do not.
nature? Okay. Do you have any specific training in human factors?
Relative to the ability of human beings to see things and what their limits are on seeing things, yes, ma'am. But in terms of psychology, what people will do when surprised from behind or things like that, no.
Any college courses with respect? You don't have any degrees with respect to any college curriculum in human factors. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I'm going to mark as we've marked as Exhibit A the notice to take deposition duces taken that I sent to you.
Yes.
And there's an attachment A on that asks for documents. Did you bring all those documents with you that you have in your possession?
I brought, yeah, when you put the word have in my possession, yes. I cannot find my high school diploma.
That's fine.
I do have a copy of my college diploma, and I have my license with me, my engineering license. I think I have everything, or can certainly refer to which one of those things would be relevant. Some of them are here in the office, some of them are at my home office.
Okay, with respect to treatises and that
Yes.
sort of thing?
For example, the Illumination Engineering Society Lighting Handbook. I did not bring that, but there are 2 copies of it here in the office I can get.
Okay. And the documents we requested, are they in the file that you brought with you today?
Yes.
Okay. And for purposes of the deposition, we will mark your entire file as Exhibit E, and then as we go through it, we may mark other parts of the file as specific exhibits.
Fine.
Mr. Sobek, when were you retained in this case?
Approximately January 24th of 2014. It may have been slightly later than that. What we would consider to be our retention had occurred when we received a letter from the client confirming that. That would be, it may have run it all the way out to March 6th, I think. March 6th of 2014 is when we got our, no, that is incorrect. That's for the deposition. About February 5th or 6th of 2014.
Okay. And were you contacted by telephone?
Initially, yes.
And were you contacted by Joe Whitehouse, the plaintiff's
Yes.
attorney? And what did Mr. Whitehouse ask you to do?
Well, he discussed an incident that had taken place on Interstate 44, just outside of Joplin, and spoke about the conditions that existed there at the site, the physical layout of the site. While we were on the phone, I actually went to Google Earth Street View and looked at the road section from their camera. And he wanted to know if I could do an analysis of the lighting circumstances and the visibility of both Mr. Rickey and Ms. Hoskins as they were made their way across the road from the perspective of Mr. Taylor.
Okay. Did he ask you to look at anything with respect to the perspective of Mr. Rickey and Ms. Haskins?
He didn't ask that, but that's naturally a part of what I do.
Okay. Did he ask you for any initial impressions based on the information he gave you on the phone?
Not that I recall.
Did you give him any initial impressions based on the information that he gave you on the phone?
I can't be certain of that. There is a phrase that appeared in the police report, and I think Mr. Whitehouse read that portion, and that was where Mr. Taylor said that he was driving west on I-44 and suddenly the right side of his truck blew up. And if it wasn't then, it was as soon as we got the police report that I reached that initial impression, because that told me that Mr. Taylor was not looking down the road, keeping a clear lookout in the seconds before impact, or he would have at least known what it was he saw or what it was he hit. I guess wasn't clear when I stated that. He's driving along the road and suddenly the right side of his truck blows up, and he said he did not see what it was he hit. And based on that, I had already reached some preliminaries that in the moments prior to impact, he was not keeping a clear lookout ahead of himself, because he would have seen what it was he had struck.
And is, okay. So your initial impression just from that statement was that he was not looking ahead of him and paying attention, or he would have seen what he was struck.
Yes.
Why he struck.
And I don't know whether or not I expressed that to Mr. Whitehouse during that conversation or not.
Okay. What have you reviewed in this case?
Well, first of all, it was the Missouri Uniform Crash Report that the Joplin Police Department filed. I looked at weather information for the date and time location of this accident, both from weatherunderground.com, who compile the National Weather Service reports from around the country, and they put them all into a master database. But in addition, I also went to the weather satellites, the what's called GOES satellites, and looked for the imagery for March 17th just before it got dark. It won't show when it's actually dark out there, because this was so close to just past the end of dusk. I was able to look at the coverage and see that there were not a lot of clouds over the Joplin area. Just north of there were, and shortly afterward the reports show that it began to be overcast. But at least at the time that the last photograph was available that showed the cloud coverage, it was still clear. I did computations for the sun position at the moment of impact as called out on the police report for that location. I looked at both the aerial imagery and street view imagery from Google Earth for this site. I also pulled up a topographic map from a source that I use, a program that I have on my computer called Topo North America 10.0. It's published by Delorme. And that gives you the topographic profile of the roads, the orientation of roads and things like that, so you know whether there's any hills or not, just confirming that it was in fact as flat as it appeared to be in the street view photographs. I examined the police scene photographs a number of times. I arranged to have a site visit conducted by one of my associates, Ms. Allison Tharp. I had her take daytime site photographs, nighttime video, and then I had fairly extensive discussions with her about what she had and had not seen as they drove through the site.
Okay. was the significance of the sun position at the moment of impact?
Well,
Well, excuse me, let's back up. First of all, the sun had already set by the time this accident occurred. Can we agree on that?
using the formal discussion, yes, of what sunset is, sunset had happened and it was now below the horizon.
Okay. So now, for my information, what does the sun position at moment of impact, what was the significance of that?
Well, I think we can all agree that if we define sunset as when the top of the sun, or what's known as the upper limb, goes below the horizon, even in very flat terrain like we have here and in Missouri, it's still light out. And in fact, you have 40-foot candles if it's a clear sky when the sun just sets. And it takes another 20 minutes to a half an hour before lighting levels fall to the point where you can no longer see fine detail and color. That formal definition is when the center of the sun, as viewed from an observer, has now reached a position 6 degrees below the horizon. And that's formally defined as the end of civil twilight. So that period between sunset and 6 degrees below the horizon is known as civil twilight. During that period of time, you still have enough light to see fine detail and color. For the next 6 degrees, that period is called nautical twilight. So from 6 degrees to 12 degrees. And then finally, although for all practical purposes in the civil world, the third period from 12 degrees to 18 degrees below the horizon is known as astronomical twilight. And basically that means that astronomers cannot do any serious astronomy until the sky gets dark enough that they can see through the glow of the sky. At the time of the incident, the sun was 10 degrees below the horizon, actually a little bit less, about 9 degrees and 50-some minutes. And what that means is that the western sky had a little bit of glow in it. And Mr. Taylor is driving to the west. So the sky is a little bit bright, but it is also reflecting off the pavement and producing a soft glow on the pavement ahead of him, independent of his headlights.
And how did you calculate that?
I use a program from the Naval Observatory, United States Naval Observatory. It's called the Multi-Year Interactive Computer Almanac, MICA. It's the same base code that you can get if you go online to the Naval Observatory website and put in the same data, you get the same answers. But in addition, MICA produces a great deal more information for the user.
But in lay terms, this was, can we agree that this was past civil twilight?
Yes, we can.
And did you determine or make any calculations to determine what the amount of illumination was out at the time?
From the sky?
Right.
I did not. I know that it will be in the range of around 0.09 to perhaps 0.1 foot candles, reaching a flat ground. If you were to put a light meter on the ground and point it directly up at the sky, your reading would be around 0.1 to 0.09 foot candles incident upon that light meter.
And how do you know that?
Well, it's been well documented by a lot of people over the years, Leibowitz amongst others, but one of my co-workers, Mr. Stuart Nightenhelser, and myself have each independently run determinations under clear skies where we mount a light meter and every minute take an illumination reading over about a 45 or 50 minute period from the moment of sunset until the meter stabilizes at maybe 0.05 or 0.06 foot candles. And those records, we plotted them in the computer. I have them available. But they basically document that under clear sky conditions, you will always see this profile of light dropping down.
And you said the published report would have been Lambert?
Leibowitz.
Leibowitz, okay.
It's going to, I think that initial document outside of the military classified world was first available in the 1972 era. The military did a lot of this work during World War II, particularly in the northern arenas.
Let's back up a minute and just tell me what opinions you have formed in this case.
First of all, it's my opinion that Mr. Taylor was not maintaining a clear lookout as he drove west on I-44. And when I say that, I don't mean to imply that he had to be looking straight ahead down the road at every single instant of time. But what I mean is that he should not have been looking away for a substantial period of time, and the limit in my work is don't look away from the road more than 3 seconds. And in this situation, the evidence tells me that there was a period of about 5.5 seconds during which Mr. Taylor could have seen 1 or 2 people going across the road ahead of him and entering into his path. And he failed to see any of those. He reported that he did not know what he had hit, and therefore he wasn't looking forward during the last 3 seconds for sure. But even prior to that, there were substantial visual cues that would have alerted him to the fact that there was somebody in the roadway. Another opinion is that the 2 pedestrians, and they might not have always been seen as 2 because Ms. Hoskins might have been hidden behind Mr. Taylor at some points based on the description that she had of something hitting her, namely Mr. Ricky hitting her. But from about 5.5 seconds prior to impact, the visual cues were such that the pedestrians in the roadway were noticeable to a westbound driver. Now, when I use that phrase, noticeable, or that word, I am referring to a set of 4 conditions that I work with in my own field to describe visibility conditions. Starting at the word invisible. In my work, invisible is a condition where no matter how long I describe to you where to look and how to look, neither you nor I will be able to see the object that I'm trying to describe to you. It is literally invisible to us. We move into the next stage when there is sufficient light and contrast that if you know where to look and I give you sufficient instruction, you will finally say, oh, okay, I do see that object, but I wouldn't have noticed it if you hadn't pointed it out. Which leads me to the 3rd stage, noticeable.
Okay, excuse me a second. What did you call your 2nd stage?
Visible.
And that is when there's sufficient light and contrast when a person would see object if it was pointed out to them?
Yes, with sufficient instruction, you can find it. Or if you just study a long time, many seconds, maybe tens of seconds, you might be able to discover what it was that you were looking for. But the noticeable stage now is in the driving circumstance. You're driving along and something is noticed in front of you, and you notice it, and you have time to do something about it if it is necessary to do something about it. No instruction needed. Nobody else has to warn you. It's just enough visual cues that you pick it up on your own. And the final stage is conspicuous, which is pretty much self-descriptive, but in talks that I give and in my teaching, I use the phrase, "You are conspicuous when you're walking down the aisle at a wedding wearing a cat in the hat." Now, I came up with that phrase first when I was doing a presentation to a group of attorneys, and we were just on the cusp of having the red and white conspicuity tape on the semi-trailers. It has not yet come into place at that time. This was 1992. And I had brought a strip of that tape along, but when I came into the presentation, I told my client, "I'll step out, you introduce me, and I'll come back in." And I came in my suit, like I'm wearing now, with a cat in the hat on my head, making myself very conspicuous. And I chose that red and white because of the red and white tape. Something is conspicuous when no one could fail to notice it because it is flashing lights and all of the things. So in this situation, it's my opinion that on the approach to the site, there were sufficient visual cues that the two pedestrians on the road were noticeable from at least 530 feet out, 530 feet from the point of ultimate impact. It's my opinion that had Mr. Taylor been paying attention and keeping a close lookout to the situation ahead of him, he would have been able to avoid this collision by simply steering slightly to the left. All the evidence indicates that the two pedestrians were either at or very close to the north white fog line. And given the distances that the lighting sources will provide sufficient illumination to see these people out there, all Mr. Taylor had to do was just shift his vehicle slightly to the, or point it to the left, not just shift it, but just turn the steering wheel so that he goes a little bit to the left. And he could have done that in about a half a second. The actual act of turning the wheel to a different steer angle would have taken only about a half a second.
Okay. So we've got your opinions that Mr. Taylor was not maintaining a clear lookout as he was traveling down the highway. You estimate he had 5.5 seconds during which Mr. Taylor could have seen the pedestrians. That, in your view, it's your opinion the two pedestrians were noticeable under the description that you provided for noticeable, and you have the opinion that they were noticeable for at least 535 feet.
Yes.
And that Mr. Taylor could have avoided the accident by steering to the left.
Yes.
Are those all of your opinions?
There's one more.
Okay, just a second. Okay.
It's my opinion that during the final 225 to 250 feet of approach, the pedestrians now moved from being just noticeable to being conspicuous. If Mr. Taylor had been keeping a lookout ahead of him, because having been alerted to something on the roadway that was interrupting the light sources to the west of those pedestrians, his vision would have been directed where this these objects, and very likely at that point pedestrians in his perspective would have been located, and now the level of his own headlighting reaching their feet and then legs and casting shadows on the pavement would have confirmed that these are people and that they are at a particular location, and what was available in the way of an avoidance maneuver would have been obvious.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you're saying that during the final 225 to 250 feet of the approach, he should have noticed the pedestrians, so now they would be more visible.
I wouldn't say notice at that point. He should have known that they were already there. I think I would probably he would have visually confirmed what they were. Anyone keeping a lookout, as he should have been on that section of road, should have recognized that there were people out there. There's plenty of visibility information available. But when you get that close, you should be able to now see feet, shadows, shoes, and as time develops in a very short period of time, the light levels move up the legs and you'll understand that these are in fact human beings. Now prior to this, having been exposed to the visual cues that are there, it's my opinion that Mr. Taylor should have gone to high beam to illuminate what was in front of him.
Okay. Any other opinions?
No.
For your first opinion, that he must have looked away for more than 3 seconds. What is what facts support that opinion?
Well, I can't say that he looked away. All I can say is that he was not keeping a close lookout to the situation ahead of him, whether it was for failure to pay attention to what was in fact in front of him or whether it was looking away. I have no evidence to choose between those.
Okay. And what facts do you base that opinion on?
His statement that, well, two things. First of all, the physical damage to his vehicle indicates that he made contact with Mr. Ricky on the right front headlamp and the right side of the hood. Therefore, Mr. Ricky was directly in the headlamp beams as the vehicle approached, and particularly being intensely illuminated by the right headlamp. Because that period of illumination is more than 2 seconds long from the time it's first of all on the cutoff point reaches the feet and then begins to move up, when you get close to an individual on the road in front of your headlight, regardless of what clothing that person is wearing, white or black or gray, the individual will be perceived as a bright flash. They will get extremely bright because they are very, very close to a very intense light source. And there's plenty of time during that closure, that final closure, to see that this is a person, to even identify what color clothing they were wearing. Mr. Taylor says that he did not see what it was he struck, didn't go to the brakes, didn't take his vehicle off cruise control until after he was aware of an impact.
And you stated that there was 2 seconds when he would have been visible as a bright flash?
More than 2 seconds of time will elapse from the point where the headlamp low beam cutoff reaches the feet and starts climbing up. And then ultimately, as you get closer and closer, the entire person will be very brightly illuminated, and full color vision, full fine detail, full perception of this is a person will occur if you're just looking in the direction that you're driving.
Okay, where did you come up with the 5.5 seconds?
That's based on several different factors. First of all, we have light spill onto the highway from the automobile dealerships on the north side of the interstate. From everything I can tell about that light layout and the building that's being illuminated and how it is reflecting onto the highway, there were very likely more than 3/10 of a foot candle reaching the southern edge of the westbound lanes, and those values would increase as you move toward the north. Now that 3/10 foot candle is meaningful for two reasons. One, I have done a number of other cases where service stations and other brightly lit complexes have cast light out onto the interstate in a very similar fashion to what we have here. And having made light measurements on those, I know that in one case it went from around 0.35 at 125 feet away from the light source up to 1.2 foot candles at about 50 feet from the light source. That was up in Huntington, Indiana. In this situation, based on the video that I see driving through there at night, the illumination levels out on the westbound lanes appears to be sufficient to have reached 3/10 foot candle. But in addition to that, I have looked at Ms. Hoskins' statement about how they made their way across the interstate. They said, I think, a brisk walk or something to that effect, going from south to north. Knowing that the lanes are 12 feet wide and that we also have about a 3.5 foot shoulder on the south side of the westbound lanes, I've made an estimate of how long it would take them to get from the edge of the inside, or the passing lane, westbound lane, to the white fog line on the north side of the highway. Those are 12-foot lanes. We probably got around 25 feet of travel, and at 5 feet per second, we're talking about 5 seconds. At the 69 or 70 miles an hour that Mr. Taylor reports he had his cruise control set at, that means that the two pedestrians entered the highway at around a time when his vehicle was around 530 feet away. So the basic facts: 12-foot lanes plus a shoulder, 69 to 70 miles an hour for his speed, and 5 foot per second walking speed.
And I'm sorry, did you say his car was about how far away?
530 feet.
Okay.
Now there's other factors that come into that. The reason that that I believe that they were noticeable at that point is that there are a number of retroreflective elements on the road and on the highway, if you will. First of all, there's a guide rail structure in the interior median between eastbound and westbound lanes. And that guide rail structure has retroreflectors mounted on it. And so there's a series of orange or amber dots. If you look to your left as you're traveling west or east for that matter, you will see these amber dots marking this cable guide rail. When the pedestrians walk across the road, they interrupt the light from those reflectors that's coming back to the drivers of automobiles, and they essentially wink out and then turn back on again, or in my terms, they eclipse those reflectors. Secondly, Mr. Taylor reports that there were eastbound vehicles on the eastbound side coming toward him. They had their headlights on, presumably. The pedestrians, from Mr. Taylor's point of view, will interrupt the headlights or eclipse those headlights as they move across the road. The headlights are moving east, the pedestrians are moving north, but in the end, the vehicle headlights pass behind the pedestrians and then come back on again. So those two features right there tell you that there's something out on the road, and they would appear to be moving because the headlights that are being interrupted are becoming further and further to the west. As they move across, if you construct that sight line, you will see that they're interrupting further and further lights off to the west. A factor here is that this highway, while it is going generally west-southwest, turns more to go straight west just beyond this site. It turns around, and so from the observer's viewpoint, the person watching this video, you're going this way and then you go around the corner this way. Well, that means that there are headlights coming around the road this way, and pedestrians are going to block all the headlights, any of them that are straight ahead down that straight section of 44 are going to be eclipsed by any pedestrians that go across the road. Now, as they continue walking north, they step over the yellow fog line on the interior of the passing lane. It's a retroreflective line. Then they step over the dashed white center lines between the two westbound lanes. Those are retroreflective. And finally, as they get onto the north side of the road, they will ultimately be viewed in silhouette against the right white fog line. And then finally, they'll step over that fog line. But in the moments before they get over that fog line, they will be interrupting the view to the right fog line with their own silhouettes. So we have eclipsing of retroreflectors, eclipsing of headlights, eclipsing of the yellow line, the dash line, and the white line on the right. Two other elements. As I mentioned earlier, there's a glow in the western sky which is reflecting off the pavement very slightly, and it will create a soft white background against which the pedestrians will be presented in silhouette. And then finally, the light from the dealership will be illuminating the northern surfaces of these people as they walk across the road. Mr. Ricky's clothes are quite dark and won't reflect a lot of light, although the shoes, the base of the shoes are white soles, but that's pretty fine detail to be noticed at 500 feet. But Miss Hoskins' clothing is much lighter colored. She has on medium wash blue jeans, a white colored top, and those will reflect plenty of light such that she would appear as a brighter object against the darker background, even brighter than the soft glow of the pavement. And above the horizon line, her white clothing will actually appear as a white object against a dark background. And finally, all of this is enhanced by the fact that they're moving. Moving objects are more visible than stationary objects. One other element. I mentioned the car's headlights eastbound. Two of the police photographs taken on the scene demonstrate this quite nicely. For all of the car headlights that are eastbound, when the camera takes the picture, you see not only the headlights of those cars, but you see two white streaks, vertical streaks, on the westbound lanes of travel. They are functionally virtual, what are called virtual images. The road surface behaves as a mirror, albeit a very poor quality mirror. If you drive down the road at night and you see a car coming toward you, you will also notice two vertical streaks on the road, which are the reflections of their lights. If the road gets really wet, then that reflection becomes more perfect. But even in dry weather, it shows up. They are silhouetted against, they, the pedestrians, are silhouetted against that pattern of light. So not only do they eclipse the headlights, but they eclipse the reflections. Now to get back to the 530, that's where the retroreflective lines will become apparent to a driver operating on low beam. They reflect enough light back that you will be aware of the white lines going off the distance almost all the way out to 600 feet out or beyond. But by the time you notice something on the lines, you're going to be about 530 feet away and to be able to say, hey, something's out there that just moved across the line.
And what data do you base that statement on, that the retroreflective lines are noticeable to a driver with low beam headlights 530 feet away?
Decades of driving and actually testing this in images, looking at features that are down the road and taking photographs of them and showing that you can see the break in the line out to around 500 to 550 feet away on low beam.
Is there any published data?
Well, there is, but it would require some inference and analysis. The properties of the paint and bead system that is used on highways are documented. I'm not sure I could lay my hands on it right now. I'd probably go to the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, AASHTO, to get some of that. But basically, it is the same structure used nationwide.
So what pathway did you assume that the pedestrian took? What angle of pathway?
What angle? 90 degrees, perpendicular to the highway.
And why did you assume that?
The goal is to go across the highway, as I understand it. The only description I have is that they had gone across the eastbound lanes through the median and were now going across the westbound lanes, and according to Ms. Haskins, actually had gotten at least to the white line. But according to Mr. Taylor, he's driving with the right side of his vehicle near the white line. And so I'm assuming that they took a path that was 90 degrees and that had arrived somewhere near the white line at the moment of impact. When I say the white line, I'm talking about the north fog line.
And where did you assume the point of impact was, as far as with respect to mile marker 10.4?
I haven't presumed an exact location. However, the rest position of Mr. Ricky's body in the police photographs indicates that it was to the east of the Range Line Road sign, because that's where he ultimately came to rest. And he would have been east of there, given the impact dynamics, hitting the fender and apparently going off the right side of the A-pillar because it took out the antenna, or severely bent the antenna on the SUV, that it would have been perhaps 100 feet east of his ultimate rest position, but a precise location I cannot be certain of. When I say precise, within 1 or 2 feet.
So you assumed that it was 100 feet east of his body?
Somewhere about 100 feet east of where his body came to rest.
And you made that assumption based on the distance his body traveled?
Yeah, basically what's called throw distance, collision dynamics.
And that throw distance could be more, could be less, depending on the weight of Mr. Ricky, the angle of the impact.
Weight would not matter so much as angle, but it's clear from the damage on the SUV's right front fender and hood that there was full engagement, and because of the way the antenna was bent rearward and to the passenger side, to the north if you will, that he was, his vehicle or his body reached common velocity or very close to common velocity with the truck as it rose up and then went off to the right hand side. It landed on the shoulder.
What do you mean by common velocity?
When you strike something, if you make full common velocity, you now hit it and the object that you struck is moving at exactly the same speed as your vehicle is after impact. Your vehicle slows down ever so slightly because of the total momentum exchange, but Mr. Ricky's body goes over the hood and off the right side A-pillar near the windshield and then falls to the ground to the right. So he didn't completely achieve common velocity, but he was driven up to a fairly high speed by the impact, and just the dynamics of falling from the height that he was at back to the ground is going to require about 1 second, and if he's going 60 miles an hour, he's going to go at least 88 feet just in the air before he makes contact with the ground, and then his body will roll or tumble some distance after that.
Did you make any measurements of the light that is actually produced by the car dealership?
Not with a light meter, no. We just recorded it with the video, and knowing what the video camera sensitivity is, I made my judgment that it probably was in the range of 3/10 foot candle in the middle of the westbound lanes. But I did not get out and use a light meter, and I did not direct Ms. Tharp to do that.
And is that assuming that it is illuminating the lanes directly across from the car dealership?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question there. The string of lights runs quite some substantial distance, and there will be a zone if you were to start east of, say by the Honda sign, there's a tall post-mounted Honda sign east of where the point of impact appears to be. If you start there and make your way west, taking a series of measurements, let's say on the center line, what you will find is the light levels increase, 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 and then stabilize, because as you're leaving one of the luminaires at the car dealership, you're approaching another one down the way. And so you're going to get a level that remains constant. And I'm assuming that they were crossing about 100 feet from the point of impact, and that their bodies were illuminated on their northern faces, and that the road surface was also being illuminated, creating a lighted surface against which the lower parts of their body were presented in silhouette. So what you have, if I can use my flashlight momentarily as a pedestrian, if we have lights over on the north side of the road striking this surface, all of these northern surfaces will be lit. The southern surface will not be lit by the lights, and so what you're going to end up with is sort of like the way the moon is. When you get a half moon, one side of it's lit by the sun, the other side's not. This surface is dark and is going to be presented against a lighter pavement surface in the background from all of the other light that's reaching the pavement. The front surface is going to be lighted, and there may be some point where you get equal brightness, but you're going to have a bright object moving to the north, and the backside of it's going to be dark. And it's big enough that you will be able to resolve it as being a human being.
Within what amount of time?
That condition exists and is only increasing in brightness from the time they start across the yellow fog line on the left side or the south side of the road. When they come across through the median, go over the guide rail, and once they start coming up the hill, they are going to be increasing their illumination levels from the car dealership continuously. And even as they're in the ditch, the median between the eastbound and westbound lanes, they will be sufficiently illuminated that they will appear as persons walking against the dark grass background in the median. And then as they come up onto the road surface, the next thing that will improve is when they step across the yellow line and they eclipse that. But they're continuing to get more brightly illuminated as they proceed north all the time.
And that is all based upon what you perceive to be the light coming from the car dealership?
Yes, both in the video that Ms. Tharp took for me and in the police photographs.
And that's from your visual observance because there were no light meter?
Correct.
Okay.
Both my visual observation and my knowledge of what those luminaires accomplish, how they are casting light onto the building and onto the display parking lot.
And what did you assume about those? I'm assuming the luminaires means the lights?
Yes.
Okay, what did you assume about the car dealership lights?
That they are metal halide, H-A-L-I-D-E, lamps, and that they are typically, from what I can tell looking at them, they each have at least 250 watts per lamp, and they may be 400 watt lamps. I can't tell that because the police photographs, the camera adapts to some degree to those, to the intensity from those. But they are standard lamps that are used in that kind of an environment. Typically car dealerships put a lot of them out to make the cars look good. But these lamps spill some light onto the pavement. Now, the pavement itself in the car dealership is occluded slightly because the drainage ditch on the north side of the highway rises up. And if you were to get down on the road and lie on the road shoulder, say, and look toward the pavement in the car dealership, you would not actually be able to see the pavement. So light directly from the pavement in the car dealership to pavement on the highway, you're not going to get any. But you're getting all the light from each of these luminaires that's up above and the splash light from the sides of the building.
Did you make any measurements to determine how far from the highway the car dealership parking lot is?
I didn't make measurements per se that I wrote down, but I have an aerial photograph of the scene, and I could make that measurement. I just haven't done it.
But your opinions aren't based on making any measurements, is that correct?
Not on making any detailed measurements. I can tell you that the observation of the location of the car dealership and its lights in the police photographs, in our own video, and in the aerial photography all confirm that sufficient light from the car dealership is reaching the pavement to exceed the minimums necessary for the human vision system to detect color and fine detail.
And what is required to detect color and fine detail?
You need at least 3/10 of a foot candle reaching the scene. Now, to be specifically detailed, you have to multiply the illuminance times the reflectance of the material that the light is reaching, and from there you can calculate the luminance of that object, or the brightness of some illuminated object. And when you do that, you need to exceed around 0.1 candela per square meter. But the basic principles are that if you have 3/10 of a foot candle reaching a scene such as this, you will perceive the scene in color and fine detail. I may have misspoken. I may have said 1 candle per square meter. It should be 0.1.
0.1 candela.
Candle. No, candle.
Candle.
Well, actually, today it's candela. 0.1 candela per square meter.
And what did you, we know that you assumed that the lighting on the pavement was 0.3, is that correct?
In general, from what I can tell, at the middle of the westbound lanes on the dash center line, it's at least 3/10 of a foot candle reaching the northern surfaces of the pedestrians.
And what did you assume about reflectivity as far as any measurements?
For Mr. Ricky's clothing, I've assumed that his reflectivity or reflectance of his trousers was probably on the order of 8%, maybe 10%. The shoes, likewise, on the upper parts, the rubber white soles were probably 35 to 40% reflective, but they are so small that they are not going to contribute to a strong visual cue until you've already identified the rest of the person. Ms. Hoskins' top was probably 60% reflective. and her jeans 20 to 25%.
Did you use any sort of a measurement device to determine that?
Just the camera and the gray card. A gray card is 18% reflective, and visual comparison of those will give you your first level, but we can take the photographs and actually measure the return from the clothing and compare it to the gray card. I haven't done that.
And do you take the 0.3 foot candle times the percentage of reflectivity to get the candela per square meter?
That's correct. But now you got to be careful. When you work in terms of foot candles, you're working in the English system or the imperial system of measure. You have to convert that into, if you're going to go for candela per square meter, then you got to work in the metric system. And so you're going to take the 3/10 foot candle, and that'll become 3.1 lux. And now you can multiply the 3.1 lux times the percentage reflectance, and you will get candela per square meter. But if you stay in the English system, then you use 3/10 foot candle, multiply it times the reflectance, and you will get the brightness in foot Lamberts.
But if I understood what we've just gone through correctly, to get color and fine detail, you need the 0.1 candela per square meter.
That's correct.
What color of light did you assume that the car dealership lights emitted?
I have not looked for the color temperature of those, but they tend to be a little more blue than car headlamps, typical car headlamps, tungsten lamps. Their color temperature will run in the range of around 3,800 degrees Kelvin, but they are very rich in blues and greens and even high in ultraviolet. Functionally, they produce nice white light, whiter than the tungsten headlamps that Mr. Taylor's vehicle was providing.
So you're assuming that Mr. Taylor's vehicle had tungsten headlamps?
Actually, halogen tungsten, most likely.
Okay. Do you know for sure? Is that just a...
That's looking at the
Yes.
lamps and looking at the model year of the vehicle. They are not HIDs, from what I can tell, high-intensity discharge lamps. So they would be producing standard, some people might use the phrase old-type headlamps, as opposed to the ones that have a distinct blue color to them.
Okay. And their color is more white?
No, the car headlamps are more yellow than the car dealership display lights. And the color temperature there, I think, is around 3,600 degrees Kelvin. To use a photography term, much more warm than the metal halide lamps.
Looking at your opinions here, you also stated that Mr. Taylor would have been able to avoid the pedestrians by steering slightly to the left.
Correct.
Okay. And what's the facts that underlying that opinion?
There are two at least. One is the damage pattern on his vehicle indicates that he made contact with the right fender, right headlamp, and essentially the right side of the hood of the car. 2 feet of leftward shift as he passed by the two pedestrians would have meant that he would completely have missed them. And at the distance that full confirmation had been achieved, even without going to high beam, he would have been able to steer left, and not violently so, just enough left that his vehicle passes sufficiently far behind them, assuming that they're pointed toward the north, that he will not make contact. But the fact that he didn't do any of those things, again, indicates that he wasn't looking in that direction and wasn't maintaining a clear lookout ahead of himself, or he would have realized that he was about to hit some people. And he wouldn't have had to have steered left so much that he traveled into the passing lane, because his testimony was that he was biased, I think was the term he used, toward the right white fog line, running on that side. So he had another 6 feet that he could go to the left and still not put his vehicle into the passing lane.
You're assuming a 12-foot lane,
12-foot lane, yes.
and you're assuming that the pedestrians are walking a straight line across the...
I've assumed the contact was made somewhere near the white line.
Okay, but you're assuming that assuming that the pedestrians are walking perpendicular across the...
Yes, but
directly in front of them.
I am making that assumption. However, at this point, I am not trying to take into account the fact that they are walking, and that during that period of time that he is maneuvering his vehicle to the left, they are moving to the north or toward his right. I'm assuming for the purposes of this that they're stationary, just for this part of the discussion, that here are two people standing on the road, and all he has to do is move left so that he passes by this way. And at the distance he has full confirmation that they are people, it doesn't take that much of a maneuver to move to the left. The friction capability in those cars' tires is well above the required maneuver capability to miss them. Now, if they're moving at that time, proceeding north, then his decision to make that turn means that they gain some northward position while he is moving to the south.
But we don't know whether they were moving or whether they were stopped.
I cannot know that from the physical evidence that I have.
And have you done any calculations to form your opinions that Mr. Taylor had 535 feet to see these people?
I guess as you've asked the question, and the answer would be yes, in that I have taken into account his testimony that he was going 69.5 to 70 miles an hour. And using 69.5 miles an hour, I have computed how many seconds it would take to cover that 530 feet, at which the various visual cues would have resolved to the fact that there's something on the road, and therefore rounded it to about 5 seconds worth of time that would have elapsed, 5 to 5.5 seconds worth of time that would have elapsed from first understanding what those cues were until he reached the point where the two persons were.
And you assumed that they were walking 5 miles per hour?
5 feet per second.
Oh, 5 feet per second. And what's that assumption based on?
Ms. Haskins described that they were, I think the term was briskly walking, that they weren't just moseying across the road, but there seems to be no indication that I can see that they were, quote, running across the road. 5 feet per second is a brisk walk.
And have we covered all the visual cues that you have indicated that the different items should have caused, that he should have seen them moving across the headlamps from the eastbound cars, the reflection from the pavement, and the reflection from the guideposts in the median?
I think so.
Those are the visual cues you're talking about?
There's some of them, and there's also just the illumination from the car dealership halogen metal halide lamps reaching their clothing and presenting them against the background surface, which is also lighted. But I think we've gone through all of them.
Okay. Now, okay, and have we covered all of your opinions?
I think so.
Have you, you mentioned that you asked Ms. Tharp to go to do a site investigation, is that correct?
Yes.
And what's Ms. Tharp's background?
She's a graduate of Rose-Hulman Technical Institute. She's an optical engineer. She worked 2 years, maybe a little longer than 2 years, at Sylvania Vallejo, or Vallejo, I never can remember how to pronounce that, designing headlamps and other lighting systems for the automotive world. And she's been with us now since last June, doing these kinds of investigations. I particularly made the confirmation that we should hire her because she understands the terminology and knows the optics.
Okay. But if I understood correctly, she made no light measurements at the scene.
That's correct.
And did you make any assumptions with respect to how far in front of Mr. Taylor his low-beam headlights would illuminate objects?
I guess, I'm not sure if I would characterize these as assumptions. It is a property and a requirement by law that headlamps on motor vehicles sold in this country must provide at least 3/10 of a foot candle at around 225 to 250 feet out in front of the actual lamp itself. Now, it's actually a much more complex requirement. There's a standard published by the Society of Automotive Engineers, or what is now correctly known as the SAE, and it's J1383. And J1383 maps out the intensity that lamps must comply with at various points within the pattern. There are maximum intensities at certain points, there are minimums at certain points. And basically what the rule is thou shalt not blind the oncoming driver in the upper left quadrant of your headlights. So you don't put much intensity up into the eyes of the opposing driver. But there are no limits on what you can put down in the lower portion here as long as you do not blind other people. J1383 sets that requirement, and when you go through the math and take into account the height of the headlamps on a particular vehicle, you find out that it's around 225 to 250 feet in front of the vehicle.
Sorry, we have about 5 minutes left on the tape.
Did you assume that Mr. Ricky and Ms. Haskins crossed the highway at a continuous speed?
Yes.
Did you make any assumptions? I mean, so you didn't consider whether they stopped at all as they were crossing?
From what I know, they had gone across the eastbound lanes, gone through the median, and entered onto the westbound lanes, and I have no indication other than the term a brisk walk that they were going across the road. I don't have any information that they sped up, turned around, walked back, or did anything other than proceed in a generally northerly direction.
Are you familiar with how the human eye adjusts to different environments?
Yes, I am.
And how does a human eye adjust from dark to light?
That's a pretty general question.
Okay, as you're driving down the road and there are, say, lights on buildings to the right, how would the human eye adjust to that?
There's two things that happen. One is instantaneously, as soon as light arrives in the eye, most of it gets sent to the proper place that the optics is designed to achieve, but some of it gets scattered and goes to different places, and so you perceive a small amount of what's referred to as intraocular glare. The further off to the side those light sources are, the less problematic that intraocular glare is.
Can that intraocular glare make it hard to perceive?
It will reduce the contrast of any given scene that's in front of you, and if it's a high contrast scene, then it won't reduce the contrast noticeably. If it's a low contrast scene, it may obscure the contrast and reduce your ability to detect something until you're closer to it. You're putting more light on it. Secondly, the pupil will decrease its diameter, or actually functionally it's the area that you worry about, and reduce the overall amount of light reaching the retina. These lights will produce a little bit of that adaptation, that's the proper term for it, these lights being the metal halide lamps, but because they are not aimed directly at the eyes, the net effect will not be enough to overcome the fact that they are spilling light onto the highway and illuminating the individuals that are out there. So you will not make them invisible just because of the glare. You won't even reduce their noticeability, and I've taken that into account when I provide my 530-foot number, that there will be some adaptation to westbound drivers as they come into the area of the car dealership, but it will not be a problem.
And what facts or data did you rely on to determine that it would not be a problem?
The very fact that our camera did not change its adaptation as it made its approach, because it will respond to very bright lights, and I don't see any change in that in the appearance of the lines on the edge of the pavement. But secondly, my experience with that kind of lighting is that if it's close to the highway, it can be a problem. But because of the angle that these lights are at and the distance that they are away, when Mr. Taylor should have first been able to see that there were pedestrians on the road, he he would not have yet adapted to those lights because he's not close enough that there's enough light falling onto his eyes to reduce the pupil diameter substantially.
And did you make any measurements or consider any particular data in coming to that decision?
Not measurements, but I have considered the adaptation properties of the human eye as discussed in a number of different documents. The Illumination Engineering Society handbook has a lengthy discussion of both intraocular glare and pupillary adaptation in the response times over a long range of brightnesses. But in addition, there's a book by Mr. Tovee, T-O-V-E-E, I believe it is, that has a good discussion on optical influences to the eye, adaptation, and night vision adaptation, essentially. But it goes all the way from very bright lights through color vision and down into extremely low light levels.
This marks the end of videotape number 1 in the deposition of James Sobek. We're off the record at 12:03 p.m.